We want to welcome you to the Bible teaching ministry of Fellowship Bible Church, where our desire is to honor God by faithful obedience to His Word. If you want to understand the Bible better, please continue to listen. You can reach us with questions or for more teaching audio and print material at our website, fbcaa.org. You can also watch our services live at fbcaa.org/live. We want to thank you for listening and pray that you will be edified.
Would you open your Bible this morning to the book of Ecclesiastes? We'll spend some time there this morning in our Sunday school period here. Ecclesiastes chapter 11. Of course, we've been reading through this on Sunday morning, just finished, I guess, last Sunday, right? And I'll admit, as I read, I thought, man, this is some challenging stuff. And I've not done a thorough study or an expositional series through it, and so to me, it certainly was a challenge to understand all that was going on, and I thought, it'd do me well to do a little more study, and maybe not through the whole book, but through part of it and or a section of it. And so found myself this week in chapter 11 and looking at verses 1 through 6, and so that'll be our text this morning, Ecclesiastes 11, 1 through 6. Maybe when you think about Ecclesiastes, you think about the theme or the phrase vanity. We read that many times. And considering how life is and the world is enigmatic, hard to understand, hard to grasp at times, in our finite fallen state as human beings, we cannot understand how God is working or why He allows certain things to happen or ordains them. And I want to be clear from the very beginning, and we were talking about this yesterday morning, the very basic understanding of what does it mean when the author says vanity. And maybe your translation has taught you to understand it in a certain way. Does your translation translate it meaningless? Maybe you've read it that way before. And I think that's not the best way to translate it, because when we think about meaningless, it comes to mind, well, then it's useless, right? Life has no meaning whatsoever. Of course, we know that's not the fact. We know that life has meaning, and even though we've fallen into sin and there's the consequences of that we don't say that the temporal world or the body is meaningless in some kind of Platonic way, if you know what I mean by that, but really that life does have meaning. And we can use our life to serve the Lord. And so I think a better translation of vanity, although a very literal translation would be vapor or breath, is to understand that life is hard to grasp. Like, maybe you can't grasp a breath, the wind. It's hard, it's enigmatic, it's difficult to comprehend. And that's what the author, Solomon, means by vanity. It's difficult, it's hard, it's enigmatic. And so I want us to understand that as we look at our passage even this morning, even though the word, I think, is only used one time, if at all, in our text, that we have to come to the text with that understanding. Now, as we look at the passage at hand this morning, chapter 11, I want to just for a moment look at the broader context or section here that it falls in, and that's chapter 9. This section, the larger section, begins with chapter 9, verse 1, and ends with verse 6 of chapter 11. And why do I say that? Well, because Solomon in this section, beginning in chapter 9 through verse 6 of chapter 11, reflects upon man's inability to understand the future. In this broader section here, he's reflecting upon man's inability to understand and grasp, using that idea of vanity, the future. Solomon repeats a few key phrases in this section, which brings me to think that this is a section in and of itself. These key phrases are things like, no man knows. Look with me at chapter 9, verse 1. He says, therefore, I have considered all this in my heart so that I could declare it all, that the righteous and the wise in their works are in the hand of God. People know neither love nor hatred by anything they see before them. Or look down at verse 12 of chapter 9. He says, therefore, man also does not what? Know his time. Like fish cannot in a cruel net. So speaking of man's end, his death. What about chapter 10, verse 14? A fool has multiple words. No man knows what is to be concerning the future. There's other key phrases that have to do with this idea of not knowing or understanding throughout chapter 9 and 10. We'll just look at verse 15 of chapter 10 right after what we just read. The labor of fools wearies them, for they do not even know how to go to the city. And then, of course, in our passage this morning, we find a number of instances where this key idea of not knowing in pertaining to the future things that we can't comprehend. Let me read our text this morning, and then we'll look at it together. Starting in verse 1 of chapter 11, Solomon writes these words, "Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a serving to 7, and also to 8, for you do not know what evil will be on the earth. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it shall lie. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. As you do not know what is the way of the wind, or how the bones grow in the womb of her who is with child, so you do not know the works of God who makes everything. In the morning sow your seed, and in the evening do not withhold your hand. For you do not know which will prosper, either this or that, or whether both alike will be good." So do you see that key phrase kind of smattered throughout chapter 11 there about the inability for man to comprehend, to understand how things are going to turn out in the end? And verse 6 uses that phrase again, but then after that, it stops using that for the most part. And so I think we can say with some certainty that Solomon is concluding this section on this theme. And he concludes this section with counsel for us as to how to live wisely in the world, despite the enigmatic nature of life under the sun, using that phrase that he likes to use in the book here. And so I think if we can come away with one kind of theme, idea, one key thought from this section this morning, it's this: that wise people labor diligently despite the future's uncertainties. Wise people labor diligently despite the future's uncertainties. And so I'd like to unpack that theme here this morning together by looking at then 3 key thoughts that support that idea from the text. And beginning with verses 1 and 2, we have this idea that with the limited knowledge that we have at our disposal, we must wisely seize opportunities as they present themselves. With the limited knowledge that we do have at our disposal, we should wisely seize opportunities as they present themselves. We pull that from 1 and 2 because, again, let me read those verses. He says, "Cast your bread upon the waters, for," here's the implication or the result, "you will find it after many days. Give a serving to 7 and also to 8, for you do not know what evil will be on the earth." Now, depending on your translation, you may say, that didn't line up with what I said there. But we'll unpack that in just a moment. Solomon begins here with an exhortation, a command, using a Hebrew idiom. You know what an idiom is? Some interpreters think that Solomon is urging generosity through this idiom. In other words, cast your bread upon the waters. Give generously from what you have to others. You could maybe understand how you could come to that interpretation. I was kind of joking with the men yesterday. He's not talking about when you go to the pond with, a loaf of bread and you cast the bread to the ducks. You remember doing that? I think they don't like people doing that anymore, right? But anyways, he's not talking about that. He's talking about something else here. And I don't think it is about generosity. And I'm not saying that because Christians shouldn't be generous. I just don't think that's what Solomon is speaking about at the moment. But if it were, then, the casting of bread and the giving of portion to 7 or 8, looking forward to verse 2, would be, distributing your wealth amongst the less fortunate. And like we said, although that's good for Christians to be generous, I think this doesn't fit the overall theme. I think a better interpretation is to interpret the idiom as a reference to maritime commerce, to trading. You remember Solomon? He was a real businessman, wasn't he? I mean, remember during his reign, the expansion, the growth, the international trade that was going on. 1 Kings 10:22 gives us this idea that he was a tradesman. He would send out, things, and in return he would get gold and silver and livestock on ships. And so it wouldn't be surprising then, as he's thinking about life and trying to understand it, that he'd use an idiom that's something that he's used to doing. That is trading, international trade. So as we look then at verses 1 and 2 and think about using our limited knowledge, we have some, but it's limited. If we're going to use that to wisely seize opportunities as they present themselves, what does that mean? What does it mean to wisely seize opportunities? Well, first, according to verse 1, to labor diligently with wisdom means we should take advantage of opportunities despite the risk. Despite the risk. Look again at verse 1. He says, "Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days." The very idea of casting your bread, if we take it in the kind of commerce way, you put something out there, is there a 100% guarantee that you're going to get a return? Well, not necessarily. Using the very analogy here, the idiom of maritime commerce, a ship goes out, there's no guarantee that ship's ever going to even make it there, much less return with the goods that you expected. You'd hope that, you expect that, maybe statistically, it'll come true most of the time, but there's no guarantee. There's always a risk in any opportunity that we seize. For you sports fans out here, you remember Wayne Gretzky's famous quote? Dan, you know what it is? You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. It's kind of that analogy here. If you don't take any opportunities, you're never going to get a return. You might not get a loss, but you're not going to get a return either. And in fact, maybe you are still going to get a loss. If we put this in the financial realm, which Solomon is doing to much of the extent here, if you don't put your money in the bank, you may not lose any of it, but you're actually losing some, because if you're not keeping up with inflation, then the value is going down. And so really you need to seize those opportunities despite the risk. There maybe is this kind of, if I can say it even this way in quotations, this Christian idea that avoiding all risk is pious. As Christians, we shouldn't be risky because, it's almost equated with gambling. You're putting something out there with maybe not 100% certainty that there's going to be a return. But avoiding all risk, I want us to understand, it is not pious. It's not pious. It's not inherently godly. Remember the parable of the talents in Luke 19? The master actually condemned the servant who didn't try to increase the value. And we're talking about finances here, and I think that's part of certainly the application here this morning. Although the parable isn't just talking about money, there's a spiritual aspect there. But whether it's the finances or whether it's a use of a gift that God's given you or some other responsibility, to not take some risk to increase, the profit of it, or if you're talking about some ministry opportunity, if you say, well, there's some risk here, so I'm just not going to pursue it, is that actually pleasing to the Lord? No, I don't think it is. I think he wants us to take advantage of opportunities despite the risk. And we see that and learn part of that from the Luke 19 parable about the talents, that those who actually invested were praised for their investment, for their diligence, for the risk that they took in serving their master. And so Solomon is encouraging shrewd, calculated, no less, risk-taking that typically reaps reward. Typically, not always, but typically. And that's what he says in the end of verse 1, does he not? He says, "For you will find it after many days." There's an expectation, a good one, that as a result of taking advantage of opportunities, you'll have some return. I think we're familiar with this kind of mantra, no risk, no reward. It's kind of like, the Wayne Gretzky quote there. Risk presents the possibility of loss, but it also presents the possibility of gain. And we need to take advantage of that. Diligent labor will result in some measure of success. Remember what Proverbs 13:4 states? A sluggard's appetite is never filled, but the desires of the diligent are fully satisfied. Generally speaking, those who labor diligently will find reward. And Solomon is helping us to understand that we should seize opportunities despite the risk. But he goes on to say something else that helps kind of fill out the picture here in verse 2. And that is, he says, "Give a serving to 7 and also to 8, for you do not know what evil will be on the earth." And so if verse 1 tells us to take advantage of opportunities despite the risk, then verse 2 is telling this: diversify amongst opportunities because of risk. So verse 1 is telling us, take opportunities. There is risk, but do it. Verse 2 is saying, diversify because of the risk. And that's what he means when he says, give a serving to 7 and also to 8. I don't think he's limiting it to just 7 or 8, but he's saying more than one. Diversify. Give a serving to more than one, to 7 and also to 8 or 9 or 10. Why? Because of risk, for you do not know what evil will be on the earth. Going back to verse 1, send 7 or 8 ships out, because maybe only 5 or 6 will make it back. We don't know what the future holds. And so it's keeping here with the theme of the uncertainty of the future. We cannot guarantee. If we were God, of course we could. We know how many to send out. We know what to do, but we're limited, and God understands our finiteness, that we cannot know as he does. And so we diversify amongst a variety of opportunities because of risk. Solomon wisely instructs us to pursue multiple ventures, as it were. We could, again, keep this in the financial realm just for a moment, but then I want us to expand our thought here. But thinking of, financial investment for a moment, when we talk about diversifying, we're thinking about, diversifying what? Our portfolio. I'm going to invest in a little bit of this. I'm going to invest in a little bit in that. Why? To hedge against the volatility of the market. In other words, you're not going to only invest, in Bitcoin. I'm not only going to invest in Amazon because, maybe they're going to be volatile and they're going to go up and down. And so, I'm going to maybe invest in a little bit of that, but then I'm going to invest in some bonds, or I'm going to invest in some precious metals. You could invest in international and domestic stocks. You could, another way to diversify is you invest in a home. I'm going to have, a hard asset like that. Or I'm going to invest in just some land, some real estate, and I'm going to lease it out and, to a business, or I'm going to build on it and rent it out. That's in essence, at least in the financial side here, what Solomon's talking about. It was a little different in his time. He didn't have Vanguard and other, brokering companies there, but he had ships that he could diversify with. He had land. He had gold, much gold and silver. But what about other aspects here? I think finances is one of them, and as Christians, we need to think thoroughly about this. But I don't think Solomon is limiting opportunities just to financial gain or financial loss. There are other ways to invest, other ways to seize opportunities, to labor diligently. I was just thinking of a few examples, and you can think of some of your own. In terms of decision making, you may choose to venture down a few different paths before you decide what is best. In other words, I have a couple opportunities before me. Maybe it's work, maybe, a job, maybe it's moving somewhere, maybe it's, in terms of my children, some decision that needs to be made. And I'm not going to just land on one right away. I'm going to maybe pursue a couple opportunities and see where that goes. And that's not wrong. Again, we're finite human beings. And, of course, we have to land at a decision at some point. But to venture down a few of them at first is not wrong. For instance, again, you may have multiple job opportunities. There's 3 or 4 companies that want to interview you. Well, don't close your door to all 4 unless you know outright that one of them's not going to work well. You pursue them until the door closes, or until you have clarity and say, this job's going to work the best for me. It's a good salary. It's in a good location, and whatever else other aspects to it that you're thinking about. And so it's wise, Solomon is teaching us, to keep the door open, at least on a few of those opportunities. But what about other examples? Can we apply these principles mentioned above to many facets of our lives? I think so. Again, just referring back to the parable of the talents in Luke 19. That instruction for us is not just about finances. It's actually more specifically about stewarding all that God has given to us until He returns, which includes, abilities and skills and gifts and responsibilities in your home, in the church, in society. I was telling the men yesterday, you could invest your time in a diverse way. I'm not going to devote myself only to my job. Why? Because I have other responsibilities. I have a responsibility to my wife, to my children, to my church. There's some who maybe have this idea that, I'm going to devote myself to this, and I'm going to give my all, and then when I'm done with that, then I'm going to give my all to this, and then I'm going to give my all to that. But listen, you're not guaranteed tomorrow. And so, if you have in your mind that, I'm going to give my all to work, and then someday, then I can really give my time to my children. Or, maybe we know that's not true, and we shouldn't do that. But maybe now I'm going to give my time to the church. Well, brother or sister, you don't know what tomorrow brings. The Lord may not have tomorrow for you. And now you've missed out on an opportunity to serve your family or to serve your church. And so I think that is a good application of this text, that we diversify not in just finances, but in our opportunities as a whole, in our time, and our abilities, so that we can get the most gain, not financial gain, but the most gain, the most benefit out of all that God has stewarded to us. Well, we need to hasten on here. Not only in verses 1 and 2 do we find that with the limited knowledge at our disposal, we should wisely seize opportunities as they present themselves, but number 2, looking at verses 3 and 4, we find this, that the uncertainty of the future and our inability to predict outcomes must not deter us from laboring diligently. Generally speaking, human beings are very risk-averse, are they not? Of course, we know the exception of people that, seem to thrive at risk and seek it. But generally speaking, if we look at all the facets of human life, we're generally risk-averse. We don't want to die before we have to, and so what do? We take care of ourselves. We don't put ourselves in precarious situations where we could get injured or whatever. And in doing so, though, we often forego opportunities in order to avoid the prospect of failure or loss. Obviously, we could take this too far and say, then just pursue all risk at all costs, but that's not what Solomon's saying. But oftentimes we go too far on the other side. I'm going to avoid any risk so as to avoid, the prospect of failure or loss. And Solomon here in verses 3 and 4 gives us a prudent warning concerning this tendency. He knows our minds. He knows how we operate. He's a human being himself. He says in verse 3 and 4, if the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or north, in the place where the tree falls, there it shall lie. Here, I think in verse 3, he's reminding us of the uncertainty of the future. And much more so, the inability to control the outcomes of the future. In other words, the clouds are full of rain. What's going to happen? Are you going to stop it from raining? It's going to rain. wherever it pleases, however it pleases, for however long it pleases, it's going to do what it's going to do. Or what about a tree that falls? Can you predict whether it's going to fall to the south or north? Maybe, depending on the wind. But how many times have you watched those videos, where someone's chopping down a tree and they think, what direction it's going to fall? And once it starts falling, can they change the outcome? If it's going to fall on the house, it's going to fall on the house. Or, and where it lies, if it's a big tree, it's going to lie. You're not going to move it until you got a chainsaw or some other, heavy equipment. Of course, they didn't have that in their day, at least that kind of equipment. And so Solomon is helping us to understand the uncertainty of the future, and much more so the inability to control outcomes. It's going to do what it wants to do. But in all of that shouldn't deter us from laboring diligently. He gives two examples, or really three. He gives the example of the clouds that are full of rain, and then the tree, and then also the wind. Now, some have viewed this section, 3 and 4, in a kind of positive way. That is, wise people apply their limited knowledge to avoid disaster. In other words, you see a rainstorm, well, then I'm not going to sow. I'm not going to do anything. Or I see that a tree is going to fall, well, then I'm going to wait. Or, I see the wind blowing, well, then I'm not going to sow. I don't think that's what Solomon's saying here. Solomon is continuing his counsel to not allow uncertainty or not allow the inability to control outcomes to deter us from laboring hard. And Solomon points to nature, as we've seen, to make this point. I think what he wants us to see is a cause and effect relationship between the rain and the falling of the tree. The rain comes, often wind comes with that, and the tree falls. Could you have predicted that when the rain was falling that a tree would fall? Not necessarily. So we can't predict these kinds of outcomes all the time. We may have some limited knowledge. We see the dark clouds and we know, okay, probably going to rain. We see the wind, well, tree may fall or some other disaster may happen. Home may blow down if it's, a tornado or something like that. But the fact is, in all of this, even in that limited knowledge, we cannot coerce the weather or change it or predict its exact effect. And so I think Solomon then is negatively speaking about watching the wind and looking at the clouds. In other words, if you are always looking at the clouds, watching the direction of the wind, what are you not doing? You're not laboring diligently. You're allowing those unpredictable situations and uncertainty about the future to actually keep you from what you should be doing. Of course, that's not to say that we should throw all caution to the wind, no pun intended there, but that finite human beings cannot wait for the perfect opportune time. But I think we often tend to do that, or maybe you've seen someone do that. I just got to wait until the perfect time. Well, what is the perfect time? Back to the financial investments, we got to wait till, the markets are, till things are low and then we can buy. Well, is it actually the lowest it's going to go, or could it go lower? Well, I got to wait. And before you know it, it's high again. Finite human beings cannot know these things. And Solomon's reminding us of that and saying, listen, if you wait, if you're just staring at the clouds all day, is it going to rain? Is it not? Is it going to rain? Is it going to not? Then you're not actually doing what God wants you to do. He wants us to seize those opportunities, to work diligently. Solomon warns of the outcome of those who wait for that perfect right time. What do? They never plant and they never reap. They've actually now had a loss. Going back to our analogy earlier, by not doing anything, you actually had a loss instead of a gain. Of course, there is danger in seizing an opportunity. It may not work out. You may not get a gain in your financial investments. You may not get the job you want. The home may not work out like you like, whatever the case may be. Some ministry endeavor may fail. But if you never tried, you'll never know. There is danger in not doing anything. You may never start. Solomon is describing people who, we might say suffer from chronic procrastination. I'm never going to start. It's not the opportune time, or I'll do it later. Or those who suffer from, maybe you've used this term before, analysis paralysis. The overthinking. I got to think of every single factor before I make a decision. Some of us are kind of more wired that way, got all the factors coming in. And I appreciate those people, I really do. I'm maybe not less that way. But those who have that tendency need to understand that there's a danger there. If I'm always analyzing, if I'm overthinking, then I'm never going to get anything done. Maybe there's also a danger that you think a little too highly of yourself, too, in that situation. That I can think of all the factors, that I do have all the pieces to make the decision. Maybe you don't, and maybe you're never going to. In fact, I can tell you with certainty you're never going to have them. There is an appearance of wisdom in calculating all the possibilities in every given situation, waiting for the stars to align. But it can be detrimental to making real progress, and that's what Solomon is warning us about. So Solomon exhorts us to stop staring at the sky, looking at the clouds, seize the opportunities as they present themselves, labor diligently, wisely, of course. Idleness is condemned in Scripture. Remember 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 10 through 12. He says there, Paul writes, "For even when we were with you, we commanded you this, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. For we hear that there are some who walk among you in a disorderly manner, not working at all, but are busybodies. Now those who are such we command and exhort through our Lord Jesus Christ that they work in quietness and eat their own bread." We could look at the Proverbs. Proverbs is filled with exhortations to work diligently and condemns the lazy, the idle. In other words, Solomon is saying here, the time to act is now. There's no good time like the present. It's not sometime in the future, it's now. We are not guaranteed, again, as we said earlier, tomorrow. Well, Solomon gives us another final thought here in verses 5 and 6. In verses 3 and 4, we saw that uncertainty of the future and our inability to predict outcomes should not deter us from laboring diligently. But now in 5 and 6, we see this idea that our inability to fully grasp God's work or His providence should compel us to labor diligently. The very fact that we cannot grasp what God is doing should compel us to labor diligently. Look again at verse 5 and 6. He writes there, "As you do not know what is the way of the wind, or how the bones grow in the womb or of her who is with child, so you do not know the works of God who makes everything." In the morning, and so here's the challenge to then labor diligently, verse 6. In light of the fact that you cannot comprehend God's providence, you cannot comprehend how He works, this is what you should do. Verse 6, "In the morning sow your seed, and in the evening do not withhold your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, either this or that, or whether both alike will be good." So in verse 5, then we see, finite human beings cannot grasp God's work. In fact, we cannot grasp His providence, the process of how the wind, moves, or the process of procreation. How does a baby really form in the womb? Even the most intellectual human beings cannot comprehend all that God has made. They think they do. Science thinks they have it all understood, or a lot of it. Take, for instance, using Solomon's analogy, even the patterns of wind. Modern science seems to have removed some of the mystery of that by, filling in the cause and effect particulars, how air molecules shift because varying temperatures and atmospheric pressures. So, we can kind of know the path of winds. But do we really comprehend all of the factors? Can we comprehend, some shift of temperature that will, affect the wind pattern? Well, no. Just look at the weather forecast, and you'll know that those are simply what? Predictions. There's no real certainty. We cannot account for every variable that might alter the wind's course. The same situation, Solomon is saying, is true of a baby in a womb. Modern technology is amazing. It enables us to, see the baby in the womb. Isn't it amazing? We can see its stages, one growth to the next, but you're You're not watching it 24/7. Probably some moms out there would love that, always being able to have the ultrasound going. But you can't, at least you can't afford it, I guess. But that would be, you can see the baby, you can hear its heartbeat, you can measure its length, you can identify its gender eventually. But there's still a great element of mystery, is there not, to how and why God has designed a baby to grow the way that it does? How do these just little cells come together to create a tiny human being that begins just looking like a little blob and eventually forms from those little cells to have arms and legs and a head and organs, tissue and muscles and bones? How is it that a mother can have a baby forming in her, and it takes weeks for her even to know that there's something forming in her? That's the mystery, I think, in part that Solomon's talking about here. I can't wrap my mind around it. We were talking about earlier or yesterday. These women who go to the hospital and have the baby, and they didn't even know they were pregnant. I understand there's possible situations where you might not for various reasons, but that too, just being the mystery, that there's a baby forming in me. Certain elements of the Creator God's providential sustaining of the universe, such as the process of procreation, like he talks about, are beyond the grasp of us fallen, finite human beings. Well, verse 6 then ends with this admonishment, this encouragement, that in light of this aspect that we are finite, we cannot understand how God works exactly. This is what we should do. We should labor diligently with the uncertainty of how we might be successful in our endeavors. We cannot know with certainty the outcome of our work, whether it will be successful. Ecclesiastes reminds us continuously of this fact. It reminds us that the righteous, what? Do not always prosper. It's an axiom that's hard to understand. We think they should, but they don't always. And the same is true in this situation of our work. There's no guarantee that the diligent will prosper. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be diligent. This just means that we don't know. We're not God. And so these verses remind us and emphasize once again man's inability to know the future. And thus, wisdom calls for us to work diligently to, if I can put it this way, increase our chances. I don't want to say luck, but our chances, maybe a more mathematical term, our probability of success. The more I try, there's certainly to be a better outcome in the end of success. Of course, from our perspective, remembering and reminding ourselves that ultimately God is in control, and God is the one that blesses, God's the one that takes away. But that shouldn't deter us from, putting ourselves out there, seizing as many opportunities as we can in any aspect of life in order to benefit, to be successful for God's glory and honor. Hard work, again, as we've said, may not always be met with success. And why is that? Well, we may not understand. And that's part of Solomon's point. We don't know. It may be that the Lord has something else better. Or he's refining your character. And he's not allowing success because he wants you to learn something, to trust him. Maybe a kind of a less godly aspect or thought on this. Maybe it's just that, you failed because it's just been a bad pursuit. Can I put it this way? You made a dumb decision, and that's why it's not successful. And so you need to try something else. There's many possibilities. Of course, we don't know that all that God is doing. And if that is the case, it's just been a bad pursuit from the beginning, then don't make the same bad decision. Diversify. That's what Solomon's saying. Nonetheless, of course, Proverbs tells us people who labor diligently are generally rewarded with success. And so we can go forward with that truism, with that general principle. If I labor, the Lord will reward. He'll provide. He'll sustain. So the imperative in verse 6, to sow your seed in the morning and at evening let your hands not be idle, means that we should not be idle, not wait, diversify, seize those opportunities, be diligent. I think a farmer, and using kind of the metaphor here that he's used, the analogy of a farmer, understands best that there's always work to be done. There's always something I can be doing. If I'm not planting the crops, I'm reaping the crops. If I'm not, if I'm not milking the cows, I'm feeding the cows. If I'm not using the equipment, I'm fixing the equipment. There's always something to be done. And so, Solomon's helping us to learn that, we should not slack off. There's no guarantee what tomorrow may hold. You may say, I'll do that tomorrow. Well, then it rains, and you can't, go out and reap tomorrow. Seize the opportunity now. Serve the Lord as you have time. Fulfill your responsibilities as you can. And so what is a person to do? Solomon encourages us not to let the future's uncertainty deter us from what we can do in the present. It reminds me of Paul's instructions to the believers, as we read in 2 Thessalonians, to not be idle, but labor for our own bread. Now, quickly as we conclude here, if we were to just simply isolate Solomon's exhortation here from the rest of the book, we've tried not to do that already. We look back in chapter 9. But if we were to simply isolate this and just read verses 1 to 6, we might conclude that Solomon is promoting some kind of hedonism. Work diligently, labor hard, you're going to get success, enjoy it. That's it. But remember, Luke 12:19 negatively portrays those who enjoy worldly gain, while at the same time leaving God and eternity out of the equation. There is a sense that Ecclesiastes teaches us, enjoy the fruit. He says that, judiciously enjoy what God has given you. You may not have it tomorrow, or you're going to die, and then you won't have it. And so there's a sense we can enjoy it, and we should. But we shouldn't then be leaving at the same time God and eternity out of the equation. We have to bring them all together. Solomon is helping us to understand that the prosperity that God gives can judiciously be enjoyed when, and here's the key, when we have a vital relationship with the one who gives it to us. When we have a relationship with the sovereign God who holds humanity accountable for how they use it. And so for finite, fallen human beings, life in this world is difficult to grasp. The term vanity, as we said a moment ago at the beginning, does not mean life is meaningless or that any temporal pursuits are inherently bad. That would what? That would contradict everything he's just said that we've looked at. It does mean life presents uncertainties, but that regardless, we should labor diligently. There is, however, certainty about some things in the future. We've kind of looked at all of the uncertainties, but there is certainty. In fact, he speaks about that in verse 9. What does he say there in chapter 11? Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. But, here's the but know that for all these, what? God will bring you into judgment. There's kind of the thing that evens the scales. Pursue opportunities, but know that whatever you do, you will be judged for it. And that should influence how we labor in the present. Let's close in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, would you help us to understand? And now, Lord, maybe the more difficult thing is to apply the various stages and aspects of life that we can apply these truths. Help us to do it well and for your honor and glory, remembering that you do hold us accountable for all that we do. And so we ask all this in your Son's name. Amen.